Continuing on, refuting Ms. Geller's claim that Hitler was inspired by Islam, James Poole, in his book Hitler and His Secret Partners, we read, Hitler drew another example of mass murder from American history. Since his youth, he had been obsessed with the Wild West stories of Karl May. He viewed the fighting between cowboys and Indians in racial terms. In many of his speeches, he referred with admiration to the victory of the white race in settling the American continent and driving out the inferior peoples, the Indians. With great fascination, he listened to stories which some of his associates who had been in America told him about the massacre of the Indians by the U.S. cavalry. Even Hitler's idea of sterilizations and exterminations of people came from America, not from Islam whatsoever. We read from the legal and medical aspects of eugenic sterilizations in Germany, American Sociological Review, Mary E. Kopp, 1936. We read, the leaders in the German sterilization movement state repeatedly that their legislation was formulated after careful study of the California experiment as reported by Mr. Gosney and Dr. Popenow. Okay, so this is where his ideas came from. How dare you try to pass this devil off onto us when he was in fact inspired by his own people, by you, Pamela Geller, by you and your people. You're the ones who inspired. Like I said, the other Western countries were already doing the same thing, so he didn't have far to look. There was nothing in Islam that could cause him to want to do what he did. Instead, it was his own people. It was you and your people, Pamela Geller. Your ancestors are the ones who inspired him to do what he did. In fact, everyone, the proof that they appreciated him so much is that after the war, America gave all these German racist Nazi lunatic scientists jobs in what was known as Project Paperclip. Go look that up, where they gave the Nazis jobs after the war was over. Here's some excerpts from an article by Andrew Walker of the BBC News, November 21st, 2005, about Project Paperclip. It reads, 60 years ago, the U.S. hired Nazi scientists to lead pioneering projects such as the race to conquer space. These men provided the U.S. with cutting-edge technology which still leads the way today, but at a cost. All of these men were cleared to work for the U.S., their alleged crimes covered up, and their backgrounds bleached by a military which saw winning the Cold War and not upholding justice as its first priority. So they weren't concerned that these guys had killed a bunch of Jews and performed a bunch of crazy experiments on them and helped exterminate them. No, they cleared the history and gave them jobs instead of executing these demons. So again, how dare you try to pass these devils off as inspired by Islam when they were inspired by you and your own people? How dare you? You got a lot of nerve, Pamela. You got a lot of nerve. Okay, then she goes into this thing about the Mufti. They always talk about this Mufti of Egypt who aligned himself with Hitler.
Wait, you asked me about a quote. And the Mufti of Jerusalem, who was the leader of the Muslim world, was an ally of Hitler and responsible for the death of over 400,000 women and children. Now, you can whitewash history, but that's a fact. And yes, Hitler was inspired by Islam. Islam was not inspired by Hitler. They came first.
Okay, number one, Pamela Geller, you said he was the leader of the Muslim world. Wrong. He was not the leader of the Muslim world. This Mufti of Egypt, he was actually made the Mufti by the British. It wasn't like the Muslim people elected him and made him the Mufti. He was made the Mufti by the British. They are the ones who appointed him as the Mufti and labeled him as the Grand Mufti. So he wasn't the leader of the Muslim world. Okay? So you're wrong in that. In a book by William Ziff entitled The Rape of Palestine, page 22, we read, despite the opposition of the Muslim High Council, who regarded him as a hoodlum, Hajj Amin was appointed by the British High Commissioner as Grand Mufti of Jerusalem for life. So it is the British that gave him this position, and he was not the leader of the Muslim world. So get your facts right, Pamela, please. Fact, the reason why, which I'm not saying is right, but his reasoning for going to Hitler was, I guess he assumed that Hitler was going to be successful, and he was hoping that Hitler would liberate the Arabs from the domination and control that the British had over them. So, but nonetheless, nobody's making excuses. It was still wrong to align yourself with this person. But again, like I said, it wasn't like if he aligned himself with the British or the Americans, it would have been any better, because what were the British and the Americans doing to black people and other people of color around the world? So no matter who he aligned himself with, it wouldn't have made a difference, because each one of these groups of people were perpetrating acts of racism and injustice against people on the earth. So it wouldn't have mattered who he would align himself, because they were all pretty much doing the same thing at the same time, the different peoples who are minorities in their own countries, or against people whom they had conquered and subdued and taken over anyway. So it wouldn't really matter anyway, Pamela Geller.
That Mein Kampf is the #1 selling book in many Muslim countries, including moderate Muslim Turkey, I think is very telling.
Okay, then she goes into this thing about Mein Kampf is supposed to be the alleged bestseller in Muslim countries. And I did some research on it. Most of this information was unfounded. The claims that they're making that it's #1 seller was based on, unsubstantiated information. They were talking, for instance, there was one article that mentioned a street vendor in Bangladesh. Street vendor. He has no record. It's not like he has a register like Barnes & Noble that's connected to a computer that keeps a record of all the books that sold. So they take the word of a street vendor and say, oh yeah, I've been selling a lot of copies. How does that prove that it's the #1 seller in Bangladesh? Because of a street vendor. Okay? And they talked about various other countries. Again, most of the information was unsubstantiated. And what's also interesting is that in many of these articles, the article itself says that most of the people who were buying the book were buying it because they said they just wanted to know about him. They were interested in finding out about this man who everybody's saying is evil, so they were looking for it out of curiosity, not necessarily that they wanted to follow his ideology. But this is the dishonesty of such people. And as always, they always throw this thing around about, oh, there's been so many terrorist attacks by Muslims since 9/11.
And there have been 15,802 Islamic attacks since 9/11, every single one with the imprimatur of a Muslim cleric.
First of all, I've never seen any, actual proof for these claims. But what they do is any little thing that a Muslim does, anything that a Muslim does is thrown in there, and they include it as a terrorist attack. And what's interesting is that I also seen a Muslim website that was doing the same thing, keeping track of everything that Christians done. You see, and she mentioned something about Muslims in Chechnya, the Uyghurs in China, etc.
What is being done to expunge Islam of the violent teachings that are inspiring jihadists in Somalia, in Ethiopia, in Lebanon, in Gaza, in France, in England, in Russia, the Chechen rebels, in the Uyghurs in China? I mean, this is a worldwide problem.
But what they leave out is that they don't tell you what's the cause and effect of these situations. They don't tell you that the Chechens, the reason why the Chechens are upset is because they have been done wrong for decades under Russian rule. So they leave that part out. And the Uyghurs in China, come on, everybody knows about the human rights violations in China, but they conveniently leave that part out. Now, I'm not saying that this justifies any attacks on innocent people, but the cause and effect is there, where they just make it seem like, oh, these people are just perpetrating acts of violence because they're Muslim. No. There's a conflict going on in Chechnya because of the injustices that the Chechens have suffered for decades under the communist and the Russian rule, you see. And again, in China, we already know how China mistreats its own people. We already know how China mistreats its own people. I will say, though, that it is wrong in either of these cases to, because you're being treated unjustly, to perpetrate acts of violence against innocent people. But nonetheless, there is a legitimate gripe there. They just have to go about it in the right way and not harm innocent people. But nonetheless, there is a legitimate gripe going there. But they always conveniently ignore that part and just say, oh, look, they're attacking here, they're attacking there. But they don't tell you the circumstances surrounding these incidents.